right, if you would open your Bibles to Luke chapter 23, in this Christmas season, to know that the one who came to us had a purpose, that is to die for us, to die for our sins. He came and he gave us hope, gave us life, but as we look into the book of Luke, we find in his end there's much to learn, and that's what we're going to look at this morning. It started about the beginning of November, maybe even sooner. You got them, I got them, the dreaded Black Friday emails. I remember looking at one and going, wait, time out. We just finished summer. Is it really that quickly? And it came, obviously, it came and all these emails kept telling us what to do. And so they said, hey, at 5 p.m. on Thursday, Throwdown Thursday begins. And, here, you got to come here and buy this and do this. And then all of a sudden, I woke up on Friday morning to more voices. Well, there was the voice of my cell phone blaring at 3:30 in the morning about a tornado around town. You're like, no, the only day I get to sleep in. And then more, as your emails are just boomed, explosion with, come here, get this, buy this now, this is on sale. And just when you think it's over, the next morning you wake up and it's Small Business Saturday. So, we got to support them too. And just when you think Saturday's over, those Black Friday deals weren't just for Black Friday, they were for the whole weekend. And so you got boom with Sunday, and Monday comes and Cyber Monday hits. Then Giving Tuesday, and your wallet is empty on Wednesday. And Throw Up Thursday or whatever it might be. And this whole Cyber Week now, and you're kind of going, really? And then I started getting, it's the 12 days of Christmas. Well, when did that come about? And I found myself just sitting there, just going, when will all the noise stop? And the reality is never. There will be so many voices, so many noises trying to grab your attention, to motivate you to make certain decisions. And it's our job to discern through things and listen to the most important voice, the voice of the Lord. In our text this morning, in much the same way, the trial and crucifixion of Jesus has a lot of noise around it. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of pull and many voices trying to push their way. And as I was reading through Luke 23, there was one verse in particular that just poked me, and I hope it pokes you as well. Chapter 23, verse 23. It says, "But they insisted, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of these chief priests prevailed." And I began to ask myself that question, whose voice will prevail in my life? Will it be the loudest, the strongest voice, no matter how mad it is, that tells me what I need to do, that I'll obey it? That maybe I'll even cave to it without even considering the cost that it may have with it? But whose voice will prevail? Or could it be in the midst of all the chaos and all the noise that I can hear the voice of the Lord in the midst of it all and what he has to say? And so this morning, the point I want to make is there will be a voice will prevail this holiday season in your life. You get to choose which one it is. Will it be the voice of the world, or the voice of the flesh, or the voice of the enemy itself, or will it be the Lord? And so we're going to look at this morning, we're going to read through a good chunk of this, because I'm not sure how familiar you are, maybe you're not, with the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. And then we're going to look at 8 different voices that surround these things. 7 of them from outside of Jesus, the last one being Jesus himself. What does he have to say in our holiday season? So, nose in the book, chapter 23, verse 1. We're going to just read through verses 1 to 49. You can take a breather. You can crack your neck, close your eyes, whatever you need to do. But I want you to hear this, because this is truth. Then the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Then Pilate asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him and said, "It is as you say." So Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no fault in this man." But they were more fierce, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place." And when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracles done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Then Herod with his men of war treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. And that very day Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been in enmity with each other. Then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, "You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people, and indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod, for I sent you back to him, and indeed nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him, for it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast." And they all cried out, saying, "Away with this man, and release us Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city and for murder." And Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus again, called out to them. But they shouted, saying, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And then he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go." But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. And he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. Verse 26. Now as they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon, a Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. And a great multitude of the people followed him, and women also mourned and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, 'Blessed are the barren wombs that never bore, and the breasts which never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the hills or the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry?" There were also two others, criminals, led with him to be put to death. And when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on the right hand and the other on the left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." And they divided his garments and cast lots. And the people stood looking on. But even the rulers with them sneered, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ, the chosen of God." The soldiers also mocked him, and coming and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." And an inscription was also written over him in the letters of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, "This is the King of the Jews." Verse 39. Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other answered, rebuking him, saying, "Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." And he said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Assuredly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Now it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. Then the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. So when the centurion saw what had been done, he glorified God, saying, "Certainly this was a righteous man." And the whole crowd who came together to that sight, seeing what had been done, beat their breasts in return. But all his acquaintances and the women who followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things. Let's stop right there. Let's go back, and I want to look at these voices that are calling out during this season. The first voice that you might take note of is we start off with the religious leaders. It's a voice of accusation. Look at these verses. In verse 2, they accuse him of perverting the nation, which was unfounded, of forbidding to pay taxes, an outright lie. Verse 5, they begin to be more fierce. And often when accusations aren't heeded, then comes this action of anger and manipulation. They're now accusing him of stirring up a rebellion, a desperate attempt to get their way. Verse 10, the chief priests and the scribes are vehemently accusing him now. It's only getting more intense. Verse 18, you notice they're crying out, swaying the multitude with their position and their power to influence them on what they need to do. Verse 21, even shouting, crucify him. And verse 23, demanding with loud voices their way. Pilate, what's Pilate to do with all this? He sees the manipulation, he sees the envy, and he kind of just says, well, let's just kind of give them what they want. Let's give them what they want. Why? Well, because it's demanding, and it's heavy, and it's loud, and it's in his face. And so he gives them what they want, but it doesn't stop right there. If you look at verse 35, once they've nailed him down, thinking they've won, the accusations now turn to belittling. He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ, the chosen of God. You're powerless. You're weak. I'm going to crush you, you loser. The false accusations. What the religious leaders didn't recognize that if he came down from the cross, he would not have paid for the sin of the world, even their sins. But it reminds me of this. Are we listening to that voice of false accusation? Even in this holiday season. They may be lies about Jesus. They may be accusations that may even be true accusations, but it's coming from the enemy. And in light of the cross, you have been forgiven. And so as you look at this holiday season and those accusations come, well, you didn't measure up, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. Hey, friend, run back to the cross. And you need to hear the voice of Jesus and not the voice of the accusations, because they're going to abound. We need to hear his voice. The second voice is that of Pilate in the midst of all this. He's got a voice of examination, of realization. In verse 3 and 4, Pilate, he's the Roman governor. He's examining Jesus. Is what his job was to do. And having found no fault in Jesus, he found out he was a king. He asks for clarification in verse 3. Are you the king of the Jews? And you is emphatic in a sense of implying, this guy? He's all beaten and he's all kind of messed up and he doesn't look like a king. He's not dressed like a king. He doesn't act like a king. This guy's a king? Are you a king? Is what he is saying. But in the end, Pilate chooses to distance himself from this whole scenario, from the verdict of a death sentence, because as if he said, religious matters were none of my concern. And so too, you will find even today, there are voices just like that. Some people who say, well, I believe he was a man, he was a historical figure, but in regards to him being king and God, I'll just leave that for whatever. This Jesus thing's not my thing. If you want to believe he's a king, that's fine with you. Don't push it on me. If you don't want to believe he's a king, you're okay too. It's Christmas. And so it's an indecisive decision here. He is a man who's examining things without saying, I'm not going to be so narrow-minded with this. He's swayed by the multitude. But we find that Jesus demands a decision from every single one of us. He says, you're either for me or you're against me. And if I try to walk that line of indecision, guess what's going to happen? The louder voices are going to sway me to their side. And unfortunately, often they're anti-God or anti-Christ in these things. So here's Pilate, the politician, tried to wiggle free and say, well, I hear you're a Galilean, so let's get a second opinion and send you over to Herod, so you deal with him. And Herod, we'll talk about him in a second, but he pushes him back to Pilate. In verse 13 through 16, after receiving Jesus back from Herod, he reiterates his conclusion. He's innocent. There's nothing deserving of death. Accusations aren't ground for such a punishment. And yet he proposes this compromise. In verse 16, I'm going to chastise him and release him to you. Kind of trying to find the middle ground. He's a politician. This is what politicians do. People don't like it, but calls out again in verse 20 to no avail, and it only makes them more upset in verse 21 as they're yelling, crucify him. And so verse 22, the third time he tries to reason with them, but unfortunately he caves. Now we think, well, why would Pilate? Pilate's a man of authority. He's a governor. Why would he not stand up and say, you guys, get out of here? Here's the backstory. Pilate had already been called on the carpet for not having order, for having problems in the city by Rome. He was called on the carpet. It said, next time it's your job or your head. And so Pilate, out of fear and pressure of an uprising occurring, all these people in Passover, he decides, hey, I'll just cave to what the people want, to wash my hands of it and say I'm done, because I value my job more, value my head more than whoever this Jesus guy is. And he caved to the loudest voices, the peer pressure, no matter how mad it was. And I want to ask you, are you listening to that voice of examination that it's continual? I won't believe until I see proof after proof after proof after proof. And it goes on and on and on. And you never come to a conclusion to say, I'm going to base my life upon it. I'm going to stand upon this no matter what the cost. I encourage you to look back at the gospel and see the heart and the hand of God, see the person of Jesus, and let that be the decision maker. The third voice is the voice of provocation, which comes from Herod. Well, in chapter 23, verse 6, when Herod gets him, Pilate sends Jesus to Herod because he realized he was from Galilee. And Herod, you remember, had put to death John the Baptist. This is Herod Antipas. He had put to death John the Baptist. And he thought, well, Jesus was John risen again. He's doing all these miracles. Man, I'd sure love to see him. He had probably read in the Galilee Gazette or whatever that, Jesus is here. Oh man, it'll be great to get tickets to that Jesus Christ Superstar show. And so he finally gets tickets and he's sitting there. Now I get this one-on-one with Jesus. Let's see the magic tricks he does and the miracles. This is going to be great. And the curtain goes up and here is this bloody, beaten down, broken man. And Herod says, that's not the miracle maker I was expecting. That's not the guy. So he starts to throw these questions at him from all angles, and Jesus wouldn't answer anything. He wouldn't answer because he wasn't into just displaying power. He wanted to change people. He didn't want to just put on a show. It's not the heart of Jesus. So out of disgust, Herod says, I don't have any need for him, and he sends him back in this gorgeous robe to mock the Jews' claim, a king, ha, ha, ha. Pilate says, I get your humor, Herod, I see that. And it says they became friends. Pilate recognized Herod's authority over Galilee. And Herod recognized Pilate's authority there in Jerusalem. And they became friends. How did the enemies become friends? It was a disdain for Jesus. Truly, Jesus polarizes people. But you'll find those voices that say, unless God jumps through hoops, unless God performs these miracles, unless God does these things this way on this day in my liking, I'm not going to believe in him. I'm not going to listen to him. And it happens. Trying to provoke God to do certain things. Jesus doesn't jump through those hoops. You'll find, somebody once said that miracles often don't produce faith, just an addiction to more miracles. And that's so true. Lord, I need a miracle. I just gave you one. It's a miracle you're still alive today. Oh, those don't count. I need a new one. Why? Even they came to Jesus and says, prove yourself, the authority you have. And what did he say? The resurrection. He pointed to the resurrection. And people today go, that's not enough. That's not a miracle for me to believe in who he is. Still pointing there. The fourth voice is the voice of condemnation from the multitude. In verse 18 and verse 21, they are stirred up and they say, away with this man, give us Barabbas instead. Crucify him in verse 21. And so they are vehement in what they're doing. Of course, the religious leaders swayed them, but they would rather have a murderer, a rebellion, a rebel that was defeated than the giver of life. You see, Jesus had come in on Palm Sunday and they hailed him as king. Hosanna, this is the one. He's the one who's going to take down Rome. Oh, this is our day. This is great. And now before them is a man who looks defeated by Rome. A man who is broken and bloodied and beaten down. And that's not the king we are looking for. Away with him. Are you letting the voice of condemnation and rejection of Jesus prevail? I mean, Jesus comes with arms open wide with an invitation to you and I of salvation. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever would believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life. You see his heart that he loves you. You see his invitation that he's offering salvation to anyone who would place their faith in him, would not perish from their sins. It's the gospel in a nutshell. With arms open wide, and we still yell away with him. let him be condemned. And there are voices of condemnation that are even in the holidays, even rejection of Jesus Christ. Don't say Merry Christmas. I'm not merry, and it ain't about Christ. And it's like, man, well, bad happy holiday. Oh, can't say that either. Bad holidays to you too. The fifth voice is a voice of derision from the soldiers in verse 36 and 37. These soldiers, these Roman soldiers, took every opportunity to put the Jews in place, to push them down, to mock them, to make fun of them. And at this time, Jesus is bloodied and beaten. He's been pummeled by fists. His beard has been ripped out. The only word you can describe in this scene is defeated. Defeated, as if you could label this defeated. From all outward views, it looks like Jesus has been defeated. Rome has crushed him. He's not a king. And they come to him and they say this, prove yourself. They're asking him, Jesus, if you are a king, rise up and take down Rome and start right here, right now. But it sure doesn't look that way. They didn't realize Jesus wasn't just a king. He was a shepherd who would come and lay down his life for the sheep. One day he will rule the world with a rod of iron, but this day was the day he would die on the cross. Are you listening to the scoffing voices of derision this holiday season? A mockery of Jesus' work, blasphemous things in his name. It's all fun and games to the world. We don't have to listen to those voices. They don't have to prevail in their season. The sixth voice is a voice of validation from the criminals in verses 39 to 42. Other gospel accounts tell us that both of these criminals were shooting blasphemous words at Jesus. While the soldiers said, save yourselves, the criminals said, save yourself and us too. Let's really validate what you're doing. Not just you. I want something in this too. Come down from this cross. And of course, one has a change of heart, comes to his senses and sees that his request is so selfish. He reflects on Jesus and his ministry and says, we deserve to die for our crimes. But he hasn't committed any. This isn't right. And he turns and says, Jesus, just remember me when you come into eternity. He wasn't asking for greatness. He wasn't asking for his enemies to be, for himself to be vindicated. He wasn't asking for any of those things. Just remember me when you come into eternity. And what does Jesus do? He says, I'm not only remembering you, you're going to be with me in that very place. But the voice of validation comes for God to be real, for Jesus to be true, that he must work in a certain way. And we have to be careful because we start approaching Jesus with the point of pride rather than humility. The one man stood in his pride, the other one, humbled by his brokenness, said, Lord, just remember me. And that was the one that was blessed. The seventh voice is a voice of confirmation after Jesus died in verse 47 by the centurion soldier when he says, truly, this was a righteous man. A centurion was over 100 or more soldiers. This was a guy who watched this whole thing go down. His responsibilities were to make sure crowds didn't get out of hand, that things were done orderly and decently. He had watched the beatings and the mockings and the scourgings and everything going on, and now he sits in control there at the cross, hearing all these words that Jesus would say. And after he is dead, here's his conclusion. It's a voice of confirmation. This man is right. This man is righteous. It's a good voice to hear. It's a good voice to hear, but let him not stop there that he's just a righteous man. Let him be the Savior, the Lord, the King of Kings for me. And so we've looked at these seven voices in a sense of going on through this time. We've seen the world's voice on the Passover holiday. It's a voice of accusation, of examination, of provocation, of condemnation, derision, of validation, and confirmation. It's a lot of noise and static. But now let's come back, and I want you to hear what Jesus says. Because this is the voice that matters most in any holiday season. You're going to hear a lot of noise, whether it's Easter, Christmas, Valentine's Day. Hey, I tell you what, come December 26th, you're going to see New Year's Eve stuff start flowing your way. And Valentine's Day, and you're going, good grief. Listen to what Jesus says. He really speaks 5 things. The first thing he says in chapter 23, verse 3, it is as you say. He brings a voice of truth in this holiday season. Matthew, Mark, and Luke say the same thing that this is all Jesus said during this trial. John brings a greater clarification that Jesus said a few other things. He asked Pilate if he was asking for himself or another. He said Jesus' kingdom would be not of this world, and that he was born a king to bear witness of the truth. But what's fascinating is that Jesus didn't answer every question from Herod, from Pilate, from the religious leaders. Why? He didn't stand up to defend himself as if I could somehow get out of going to the cross. No, Jesus knew, Isaiah 53, that he would be led as a lamb to the slaughter. He didn't open his mouth. And I can just speak the truth. When it comes to the position and the mission, I can just speak the truth and let it lie. You said it, Pilate. And 1 Timothy 6:19 tells us that there was a good confession before Pilate. And in all the voices, in all the chaos, how we need to hear that voice of truth that rips through all the fake news and all the false accusations and all the half-truths. And we say, no, Jesus said he is who he is. And I'm going to stand upon that, even during this Christmas season. Number 2, he's a voice of warning and reason. In verse 28 to 31, as he is being led away to Calvary down what was called the Via Dolorosa, up to Calvary, there are these women, there are mourning and weeping, and not everybody was against Jesus. Some were for him, and they're just seeing this one who had touched their life just crushed now. And he turns to them and basically tells them, daughters of Jerusalem, hey, there is a greater mourning coming. For in 37 years, at 70 AD, Rome would come in to destroy Jerusalem. And he says, there's a greater sorrow heading your way. Destruction is coming, and you're going to cry out to the mountains and the hills to fall on us. In other words, you'll be crying out, it's so much better to be dead than to live through this. Just a heart-wrenching time. It amazes me that under the pain and the pressure of the cross that he would even stop to address it. But he does. It's a voice of warning. He gives this proverb in verse 31. If they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry? In other words, if the Romans condemned to death Jesus, who's like the green wood, the king of the nation of Israel, what would happen to the nation itself that is dried out? It's a terrible, terrible time. But how we need to hear his clear voice, not only of truth, but his clear voice in our chaotic world, when everything is going sideways and upside down and we don't know what the future holds, that we can hear his voice and say, look, he's warned us, and he wants to reason with us because he doesn't want us to be destroyed by our sin, that we would come and ask his forgiveness. Forgiveness. Well, that's the third voice we see. There in verse 34, Jesus said to them, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. Truly remarkable words. The first words he says from the cross, forgive them. He would say a total of 7 words from the cross. But what's fascinating is when he says forgive them, it's in the imperfect tense, which doesn't mean forgive them for this one-time event. It's a continuation, a continual impact. It covered the whole account from past to even forward, the whole account of him being crucified. Forgive them for beating me, for pulling out my beard, for falsely accusing me, for lashing me with whips, for condemning me to die, for piercing me with nails, for crowning me with thorns. Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Isn't that powerful? And yet that's his heart. What they do ignorantly, it is still sin. Jesus went higher. He begins to intercede for them to the Father. He says to them, love your enemies, and now he's showing it them right there at the cross. And what a voice we need to hear during the holiday season. Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Truly. The things that are said, the things they do, it's the prevailing voice in the holiday season, Jesus's. We don't know the wretchedness of our own sinful state. And Jesus comes saying, I want you to forgive them. So we see his voice. He's a voice of truth. He is the King. A voice of warning to turn from our sin, to reason with him. A voice of forgiveness. He's also a voice of hope. Verse 43, when he says to the thief on the cross, assuredly I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise. And to the broken who know their sin, who in humility bow down in a sense, who say, Lord, you are a king and your kingdom is real. Remember me. The Lord gives this promise of hope. You'll be with him in heaven. And that's a hope this world can't touch. And of course, the last thing he says there, a voice of surrender in verse 46, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And in the end, we are all faced with that question, what will I do? What will I do? What will I do with this person, Jesus? What will I do with my life? And I love what he does. Simply surrender it all into the Father's hands. I'm yours, Lord. From birth to death, I'm all yours. While the world screams all these accusations and all this hubbub and all this static and noise, here's Jesus. Here's Jesus, the voice of truth, the voice of reason, of forgiveness, of hope, of surrender. A whole bunch of voices are crying out and they all lead to death. And his voice that leads to life is the one we want to hold on to. So the last question is, whose voice will prevail in your life during this holiday season? Is it going to be the world's? With false accusations and condemnations and telling you don't measure up and telling you you got to jump through these hoops and this, that, and the other? Or will it be the simple voice of your Savior that says, hey, I want you to forgive him. I want to bring you hope. I want to bring you life. I am the King. May the word of the Lord prevail in our life today as we face the future.